Fantasy has been one of my go-to genres for over 30 years now, so it is high time to take stock and share with you some of my most beloved, some of the best, and some of the most epic fantasy series out there. Now, as always, I will be linking all of the books I talk about down below in the description so you can have a look for yourself. So, pack your broadswords, bring some lembas, because we're diving into the top 10 of fantasy series. At number 10 we find Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell by Susanna Clarke. Now, the year is 1806 and the place to be is England. And Mr. Norell is the nation's favorite. It is the most grand wizard they have. He raises people from the dead, helps with the war effort against France, and he aspires, no, he knows to be the very best magician England and perhaps the world has ever seen. But then there's Jonathan Strange, a young man who happens to know some magic himself and could be very well the one contender that jousts Mr. Norell from his position as the nation's favorite. Susanna Clarke does a very interesting thing with this book. It reads like you were reading historical fiction. It has proper historical figures in it, like Lord Wellington or Byron, which gives it that authenticity, and you sometimes forget that this is not the real England in the 19th century you're reading about. In fact, if this book would not have the magic that it is all about, it would read like a Dickens novel or a Jane Austen maybe. It is one of the most original stories out there, and Susanna Clarke shows herself to be a master storyteller. Opening our top 10 for today are Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell by Susanna Clarke. At number 9 we find the Belgariad Chronicles by David Eddings. Now, these epic fantasy books are my youth. I have read them over and over again when I was a much younger person, and I still love them today. In the first book we meet Gaiman, a simple scullion stable boy who lives in a very ordinary farm. There's nothing extraordinary or special about anyone who lives there, until that one day. From there on, an epic fantasy journey starts, all across the continent, all over this great fantasy world, following Gaiman and his adventures, and spanning several books, including spin-offs on some of our most beloved characters in this series. And yes, I will happily admit that it is a bit trope heavy. I mean, it is the stable boy becomes hero trope. And yes, it does sometimes remember of a certain other fantasy story. I mean, it is about one person having to undertake an epic quest to battle the final big evil, and he's helped on that quest by a myriad of people coming from different backgrounds, different nations, different races, and they are led by a somewhat sarcastic, roguish Guin wizard. Sounds familiar? But that does not diminish the fun that is the Belgariad Chronicles, and I will love them for the rest of my life. I will be rereading them over and over again until my copies just fall apart. So, number 9, first epic fantasy series, the Belgariad Chronicles by David Eddings. At number 8 we find another epic fantasy series, but of a whole different kind. I'm talking about the Poppy War Trilogy by Rebecca F. Kuang. I know not everyone is a fan of these series, but imagine being 19 at the time and writing this series, this trilogy, as your debut. It was refreshing in its kind because it gave us an other different sort of fantasy, an Asian-inspired fantasy, something we had not seen before. Another thing that the Poppy War Trilogy does very, very well is make you care for characters and show that war is not to be romanticized. It is something that devastates lives, that devastates people, and that it leaves its mark on a country. Rebecca Kuang did a great job in this series of creating a refreshing new world. Something we had not seen before, and I absolutely love the series for this. So, at number 8, popular trilogy by Rebecca F. Kuang. On number 7 in our top 10 we go back to the roots, back to the classical fantasy with the Legends of Drizzt Chronicles by R.A. Salvatore. Now, if you have ever played a Dungeons & Dragons game or read any of the source books or maybe played a computer game or have picked up one of the Forgotten Realms books, then you might probably know Drizzt already. Drizzt is a drow, a dark elven male in a society led by very vicious, cruel female hierarchy. Males are good for war, males are good for slavery, males are good for breeding. And then there's Drizzt, probably one of the lowest castes in society, but born into nobility, so people do give him a berth. Drizzt does not want to be just another cruel weapon in the war against humanity. Together with his trusted feline companion, he undertakes a journey that takes him out of his world, up to the surface and into a whole different experience. The Legends of Drizzt take you on a journey not just through Forgotten Realms and the whole world of Dungeons & Dragons, but it is a great character journey as well. It is a book about found family, about not belonging where you were born, but searching for that place where you might just fit in. And just as Drizzt finds people that actually accept and love him, you as a reader, and together with thousands, perhaps millions of readers, will come to love Drizzt as well. So, at number 7, the epic classic fantasy, The Legends of Drizzt by R.A. Salvatore. Now, while I was compiling this top 10 and this list, it did become very clear to me that I am lagging way behind on modern day fantasy. Now, I am reading Fourth Ring already. I might do a video on it on a later date. But I am not versed in the Erin Morgensterns of the Schwabs of this time and age. So if you have any modern fantasy recommendations for me, do let them know in the comments, because I am way behind, it seems. But enough of that. Number 6. At number 6, I'm going for the Witcher series by Sapkowski. Now, forget the Netflix series. Forget the computer games. The books are the original Witcher series. Sapkowski manages to create a grimdark, very original world that very often reminds of folklore and the original fairy tales. You know, the ones where children get eaten and witches do not always get burned at the end. We meet Geralt, a character we all know and love by now, and he's a witcher. In a world where he's hated, he's scorned, he's spat upon, but he's also found very necessary, because there are much bigger and much more dangerous creatures out there. In a world full of racism, hate, political intrigue and war, we find that the world of The Witcher might not be very different of our own. The Witcher series is deliciously grimdark, with very morally great choices. There is no ultimate good and ultimate evil, just people trying to survive against all odds often. Sapkowski does a great job of bringing those old vibes, those old folklore influences into something that feels fresh and modern. It is cruel, it is grimy, it is dark, and I absolutely love it. Do Google the reading order though, because it can sometimes get a little bit complicated in which book comes first. But apart from that, number 6, The Witcher series by Sapkowski. We enter our top 5 with some young adult fantasy. At least, so it is said. I don't always agree, because the topics in these books are very profound and are sometimes felt very deep. I'm talking about the Earthsea cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. We meet Gad, a young boy, a young man who is a magician, and he's very proud of that power he has. Now, hubris always comes to a fall, and he makes a terrible mistake. A mistake he's not powerful enough to handle. Now, throughout these books, throughout the Earthsea cycle, we follow Gad on his journey of redemption, on a journey of self-exploration. And he quickly becomes an unforgettable classic fantasy character. The thing with Ursula K. Le Guin is that she is a master of prose. Her books, her texts always feel almost poetical, and she has the most beautiful descriptions which brings these unique worlds to life. A sense of wonder just jumps from the pages at you as you explore these very archipelago-like worlds that she has created in the Earthsea Chronicles. This series is one of the absolute fantasy classics that every fantasy lover should read at least once. They are magical and wondrous and well written, and they take you on a journey that, deep in its essence, fantasy is all about. So if you haven't read them, do give them a try, because I can't recommend the Earthsea Chronicle saga enough. At number 4, just shy of our top 3, we have our first urban fantasy setting. It is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Now, Neil Gaiman has to be one of my favorite authors of all time, and Neverwhere is the book I like best. In Neverwhere we discover this alternate reality, this hidden city, this hidden copy of London just below the actual London we know today. It is a strange underground world full of fantastical beings and creatures, and it is not something that we mere humans are supposed to see. This all changes when Richard Mayhew, a young businessman who just moved to London, who is on his way to have dinner with his fiancée, suddenly sees this young woman who is wounded, who is weakened in an alleyway, and he stops to help her. Capital mistake. All of a sudden, everything goes wrong. He seems to have become invisible. People do not recognize him, not even his own fiancée. He loses his job, and when he tries to go back home, his apartment has been rented out to other people. Richard is now a reject, and the only thing he can do is find his way down to this strange world this girl that he helped in is living in. From there on, he starts a most fantastic and epic and exciting journey through a very well crafted world. Neil Gaiman has that ability of creating worlds, creating characters, creating lore that is absolutely unique. It is different, it is exciting, it is thrilling, it is dark, it is funny, it is everything. And it is a book that only Neil Gaiman could write. As one of the only, together with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norell, standalone books in this top 10, Neverwhere is something you absolutely have to read if you haven't already. And if you have already, go to a reread. So, at number 4, just shy of our top 3, Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Before we dive into our top 3, I want to do some honorable mentions. Books or series that just did not make the top 10 but are universally loved. First up is A Song of Ice and Fire by J.R.R. Martin. A very well-known, very famous, televised, very good, I'm told, fantasy series. But for some reason, J.R.R. Martin's writing style is just not for me. I find it repetitive and at times even boring. So I might start reading through them again once he finishes the series, but for now it's not one of my favorites. And then there is the Grishaverse books by Leigh Bardugo. Again, the first 3 books I thought were a bit long-winded. I understand that you have to introduce a lot of new lore and world building and how magic works into books, but could we please get on with the story? Now I will say that from there on, with Six of Crows, things get much better, and I do find it a very interesting setting, but again, not yet good enough for my top 10. And then we have the Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb. Again, classical fantasy loved by many people. I could also put Ted Williams up here. Again, classic fantasy, but sometimes the stories get a bit boring and it get a bit too long-winded for me. Now, last honorable mention goes to Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Is it fantasy? Not entirely sure. Perhaps vampires are a genre of their own? But this book seems to be forgotten. And it's a shame because while it is a bit cringy at times, it is still one of my favorites from my youth. And it introduced me to the whole darker fantasy settings and darker world of vampires and how they feel. The Vampire Lestat is one of the most beloved characters in vampire history, together with Dracula, I guess. And it is still a book that I highly recommend if you're into blood-sucking fanged fiends. And then we enter our top 3 and we are going grimdark again. I'm talking about the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. If there was ever a master of the grimdark genre, then it must be Joe Abercrombie. I mean, the guy is nicknamed Lord Grimdark. Joe Abercrombie is a master of writing characters. In fact, Joe Abercrombie is a master in writing morally grey characters. Every character has his flaws, but every character has his redeeming characteristics as well. Even the ones you do not like. Joe Abercrombie excels in this. He excels in character-driven stories, and for that he rightfully so earned that 3rd place in my top 10. I absolutely love his books. I absolutely love the grimdark atmosphere he brings and the often very difficult struggles these characters go through. First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, highly recommended. And then at number 2 we meet Terry Pratchett again. The Discworld series is a lot of things. What originally started as a satire on classical fantasy tropes quickly became a very well written, very rich tapestry of characters in a absolutely unique world that is the Discworld. Terry Pratchett understands that with every laugh comes a tear, and these characters are very well written. They have their own character arcs, despite of the main story that is heartfelt, emotional, and can be very recognizable. He brings a rich world with a myriad of very different and sometimes fantastical characters to his books, and you have to love them. Who does not know Luggage, or Death, or Rincewind, or Captain Vimes? For Discworld readers, these names have become household brands, and no one else could have written them. Terry Pratchett manages to hide his social critiques by telling very entertaining and sometimes even silly stories. But the underlying truth is there. He dares you to think out of the box. He dares you to think out of the system. And that is, for me, what Discworld is all about. It is one of my favorites, perhaps the most favorite fantasy series that I have ever read. I have all of the books on my shelves behind me, and I will keep collecting every Pratchett book that I can get my hands on. Now, with so many books, it can be a little bit daunting to know where to start, but don't you worry, I made a video about that. Now, the Discworld series is one of those series that I would love to read for the first time again, but alas, that's not possible. So, at number 2, one of my all-time favorites, one of the books or one of the series I will never shut up about, the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. And then finally, at number 1, we have my own fantasy series. No, of course not. I'm kidding. It has to be Middle-earth. Now, here's the thing with Middle-earth. People do not always see it as a series. Yes, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are somewhat connected, but that's about it. But once you start to see the Middle-earth for what it is, which was a vastly huge undertaking of creating a new world with new cities, new races, new languages, new scripts even, then you start to understand why Middle-earth is such a profound base of all fantasy that we have seen ever since. Now, by creating this vast universe, this multiverse almost, he opened up avenues for young fantasy books like The Hobbit. Or perhaps you want something that's a bit darker, a bit more psychological. There you have Lord of the Rings. You have your classical fantasy, almost folklore, Old English tales. Children of Huron. The Middle-earth series has something for everyone. To think that all of this came from the mind of one man is almost unfathomable. So we have to do him homage. We have to give him the honors that he is due, even if you don't like this or that part of his universe. J.R.R. Tolkien is the grandfather of modern fantasy, and he absolutely deserves this #1 spot, according to me. But then again, who am I? Let me know down below in the comments which series I missed, which entries you agree or disagree with. Let's talk some fantasy some more. And after you're finished with that, do watch another video if you will.